Welcome to Tomorrow Never Knows with me, Bob Wilson, and Sir Warren Brown of the Beatles Kingdom. Today, the legendary Ivor Davis will interview a second legend, Mr. Art Schreiber. So be ready as we turn the microphone over to our good friend, Mr. Ivor Davis. First, a word from our sponsor. Beatles Magazine is a publication with 370 plus million visitors on all their pages, read by thousands of fans around the world every day. Beatles News is updated daily, 24 hours, audio, video, photos, interviews, contests, additional materials, and even more. So follow Beatles Magazine, the most complete online coverage, 24 hours a day, and how many days a week?
8 days a week.
8 days a week it is. So welcome, Ivor and Arthur, and it's so good to have you here. And Ivor, I have to ask you, you brought a special guest on, so we're turning the microphone over to you, because I said to myself, we have a special guest, what can I do to make this a good show? And I said, let Ivor do the interview. So there we go. So I pulled you in there. So please introduce your guest to us, and you take it away.
Well, it's a great privilege to be on this show with Art Schreiber, who is a legend in the broadcasting business. But I knew him shortly before he became a legend. I met him in August 1964 when I was lucky enough to join the Beatles on their first American tour. And who should I meet but Mr. Art Schreiber, who's with us right now. Now, Arthur, you've got to tell us what a joyful assignment you were given by your bureau chief, and yet you said no. You said, I don't want to go on this. But you tell the story. Why were you so against going with the Beatles?
Yeah, okay. I was news director for Westinghouse Broadcasting Company in Cleveland, Ohio. At that time, Cleveland was one of the top 10 markets in the country. Westinghouse had big markets stations. In those days, you could only own 5 AM stations, and Westinghouse. No, you could own 7. Westinghouse owned 6, and famous ones such as KDK in Pittsburgh, WINS in New York, WBZ in Boston. Okay, one day I went to lunch. I came back. I always stopped in the program director's office, and here sitting around the room were all the disc jockeys, the production manager, the music director, even the public affairs director, and it was like a wake. And I said, what happened? And a voice said, WHK got the Beatles. Now, WHK was our big competitor in Cleveland, and I knew what that meant, that they had paid money to bring the Beatles to Cleveland. And of course, all our people were devastated because they thought that was going to kill the ratings for us. And I don't know whatever possessed me, but I said, why don't you put me on the Beatles tour? And the program director jumped up, ran in the manager's office, and it was a long story. From there, they had to go to New York to get permission, blah, blah, blah. The national news editor or bureau chief a job that I was to later have, he said, no way is Schreiber going to cover the Beatles. He's got to cover the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. And it was at the same time as the Beatles tour, as when they arrived in the West Coast. But the president of the company interceded, and he made a compromise with the bureau chief that I would miss the first week of the tour and join them in New York when they came to New York, and then be on the rest of the tour. And that's the way it was. When I went home to my wife and told her I was covering the Beatles, she couldn't believe it, because I was in the news business. I did not know anything about music. I didn't pay attention to who was number one, any of the records. I just wasn't my shtick. And to this day, if my son were on this broadcast, he would say the last person in the world to put on the Beatles tour would be his father.
That's a terrific story. But let me ask you this. Art, were you thrown in the deep end, and did you struggle before you found your foot, or are you such a person that can improvise that within 24 hours you were bosom buddies with the Beatles? What happened?
Well, yes. The first place I said that when I went home that night, I said to my wife, we're going to go see the Beatles movie. And she just looked at me in aghast. And we went to a drive-in, and I took my two children who weren't really old enough. One was 5, the other 8. And we all sat, and I fell asleep in the movie. But I then went to the library. Don't forget, there were no cell phones, no computers, no satellites in those days, at least not for commercial use. And so I had to dig up as much as I could, learn quickly about the Beatles. And that's what I did. But when I got to New York, and of course I met Ivor very quickly. He was one of the 3 British correspondents on the tour. I was one of the 2 American. All these guys were, I assumed, were hotshot reporters, and I didn't know anything about who I was covering, and I thought, am I ever going to be able to do this? And as you know, it ended up that we all did pretty well. Well, you guys did much better. I always blamed you for being British and for me not being a very good reporter.
Well, to be honest with you, you're underestimating your own brilliant skills as a reporter, because I remember that very quickly you and the Beatles became bosom buddies. And in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, Art, but didn't John Lennon invite you up in the middle of the night to play Monopoly and talk to him? So you must have been a quick learner.
Yeah, yes, that is true. As you know, we finished, they did 2 performances in New York at the old Forest Hills Tennis Complex. And by the way, Murray the K was the disc jockey that called himself the 5th Beatle, and he worked for the same company I did, and he wanted to cover the Beatles. And when I was assigned to that tour, he never forgave me. And a few weeks prior to his death, he flew to L.A., where I was then managing an all-news radio station for Westinghouse, KFWB, and he apologized to me for what he did during those days. But Murray was devastated that he didn't get to cover the Beatles. But anyway, the first night we were in Atlantic City, John Lennon said to me, Art, do you play Monopoly? And I looked at him and I said, well, I play with my kids. He said, I have a board. And he said, these other guys don't like to play, they play poker. And he said, would you play? I said, yeah, I'll play. And so he invited me up that night, and as you well know, almost every night for the rest of the tour, we played Monopoly.
Do you remember, Art, on one occasion, John got on the phone and called his 1-year-old son in England, and remember that we listened to one side of the conversation? Do you remember that?
I sure do, because I kick myself today that I didn't take my recorder up to the Beatles suite when we played Monopoly. I didn't feel that was, I never asked about it, but I just didn't think that was what I should do. I always regretted that, because I wish I had that recording. I heard it probably all the time, those 3 weeks. I'll bet he called his wife at least 5 times while I was there. Early, it'd be very early our time, and he'd say, we got to stop playing. I got a call. And then he would say, put the baby on, and he would talk to the baby in baby talk. And he would say, talk to daddy, goo, 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 things like that. If I only had those recordings. But Ivor, that wasn't the only thing I did. I sat with John on the plane all the time, as you know, and Paul would come up, and they were writing music at the time, and they would discuss what they were writing, and all those papers went on the floor, dozens of them. The floor was littered with those papers that John and Paul threw on the floor. I never picked up one of them.
Wow.
Oh, dear. But the other thing is, I don't want to interrupt. That's a wonderful story, Art. But you, I mean, I was envious because I only had to write one story a day. You had to write, and you had to file more often. Can you tell us how often you had to file?
I filed 3 times. I filed between 7 and 8 in the morning. This is Eastern time. I filed then at noon, and I filed between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I filed 15 stories a day.
Wow.
5 each time, and then during the performances, I would have to call one of the stations and talk to their key disc jockey, and we would talk on the phone while the Beatles were performing, and of course then just dozens of times during the day and night I received calls from the 6 radio stations that we were, and then while I only covered for Westinghouse, the networks suddenly couldn't get in to the Beatles tour, as you know, and the NBC suddenly was blocked out, CBS, ABC, and so many of those stations purchased my coverage from Westinghouse, and many other stations around the country then also picked up our coverage, and so I was heard a lot of places other than Westinghouse stations.
What happened to all those recordings, Art?
Well, when I got back to Cleveland, my program director said, we're going to do a special, so, I want all your tapes. And I laid the tapes out on my desk. There were dozens of them. I used a Grundig tape recorder. Maybe Bob knows about a Grundig. He's probably too young to know about that, but it was one of the very earliest portable tape recorders that we used in the broadcasting business, and it used a little tape, not a cassette, but a round tape of about 3 inches, maybe. And you had to thread it on the tape recorder, and then you started. Well, the bottom line is that I went in one morning and all my tapes were gone. They were all wiped out. Someone stole them.
Wow.
My office was locked, but someone broke into it and took all my tapes.
Wow.
Years later, the only tapes I have today of my interviews with the 4 Beatles are tapes that a man, I was at a fundraiser, not for the Beatles, but I was at a fundraiser in L.A. One time, and I left that fundraiser, was headed for my car, and a gentleman said, he introduced himself and said, I know who you are. He said, I have heard your talk about the Beatles. And he said, do you have any tapes? And I said, no, I don't. And that was our introduction and our meeting. A couple of years later, he sent me from New York. He had been transferred then back to New York, whatever job he did. And he sent me a disc with, probably a dozen Beatles interviews with me, and he found them on the internet. Those are the only tapes I have today of the Beatles, is what that gentleman sent me.
Arthur, there is a fantastic story that I'd love you to tell, because when you got to Cleveland, and you said a moment ago that the opposition radio station had exclusive rights to the Beatles, but something happened in Cleveland to the performance. Tell us about how you scooped everyone.
Well, that was probably the best scoop I ever had in my life. As you know, WHK now was paying at those days $25,000 to bring the Beatles to Cleveland, and of course I got put on the tour. When we arrived in Cleveland, the WHK disc jockeys were all gathered at the bottom of the plane. If you remember, in those days, the stairs came out from the fuselage, and they went down, and then everybody came down the steps to the ground, and all the disc jockeys were wearing their special jackets for WHK, and I walked down with John Lennon, and one of the WHK jocks asked him a question, and he turns to me and he says, "Art, should I answer?" And that is what happened then at the press conference that the WHK fellows had, as you know, always the sponsoring organization had a news conference, and you and I and the others that traveled with the Beatles, we stayed in the back because we didn't interrupt their questions and so forth. Well, okay, that happened there at the plane. That night at the performance, it was held in the city arena in Cleveland, and the kids started standing up on the backs of the chairs. The seats were permanent; they were solid, but they were standing up on those seats. And if you remember, the assistant police chief and fire chiefs were there. They stopped the performance, and it was wondered that it didn't become a riot. Well, when they stopped the performance, I was on the wings watching from the wings, and Lennon came storming off, as did the other Beatles, and he said, "Come on, Art." And I went in the elevator with them and went up to the green room, and as soon as we got to the green room, I locked the door. Well, I grabbed the phone and called the radio station, and I was interviewing the Beatles while the performance was stopped, and WHK was stuck with all their people right down there at the concert, but they couldn't talk to anybody except the police and a few fans.
Yeah.
But I got the Beatles, and I had them, and people were banging on a door of the green room, and I just sat there until finally we finished. It was time up, and I opened the door, and that was a great performance for our radio station, KYW, and WHK never got over it.
Yeah. Well, that was an incredible time, but the advantage that you had was the fact that they liked you. The Beatles liked you. John, who, by the way, would have been 80 in October had he lived. Yes. It's hard to imagine. But sorry, getting back to the question, Art. I mean, you got on so well with them. John was as close to you, and everybody always wants to know what were they like then. And so I'm going to ask that question because you've been asked it dozens of times, and so have I. But tell us again, from the Art Schreiber point of view, what were they like back then?
Well, John, for whoever told him, and I assume it was Derek Taylor, their communications guy, we call them press agents in those days. I assume Derek told him because what I was doing in Westinghouse at that time and all our big stations, we started a news bureau just as the networks did. Now, we were just getting started. So, but I had been assigned to cover first manned space. That was the first thing I covered from Cleveland, but I'd go on special assignment. Then I was asked to cover politics, and I traveled with Jack Kennedy and others, but before Kennedy was ever nominated for president, I traveled with him on his campaigns. Incredibly, in those days, Sandra Van Oker of NBC and I would be the only two reporters sometimes, and we'd get in the same limo with Jack and Jackie. That's unheard of today. Then I was assigned to civil rights, and I traveled with Martin Luther King all through the South. And I was on the Selma to Montgomery March. I was with him at the Lincoln Memorial for, his famous I Have a Dream speech. We really got to know each other. And then I covered a lot of politics. Well, Lennon somebody had told him about this. And when we sat together on the plane, he never wanted to talk about music. Of course, I didn't know anything to even ask him about music. But he would say, he started asking me about first Jack Kennedy. He had met Kennedy, and he couldn't understand what happened because Kennedy was assassinated. Then, later, of course, other assassinations, but that was prior to when we were on the tour. But when he found out that I had covered the funeral of Jack Kennedy, he wanted me to tell him about that. And then he wanted me to tell him about my times with Martin Luther King. He was very interested in politics and what was happening in America. He could not understand why we were having such racial difficulties. In those times, at that time, we were going through a lot of racial riots. And I was also assigned to cover those race riots. I covered race riots from border to border and coast to coast. I covered Watts in L.A. I covered New York. I covered Buffalo, New York. I was all the big ones, Chicago, Detroit. And John wanted to know why was this happening? Well, I didn't know either, but I had some ideas about it. And we spent an awful lot of time talking about what was happening in America. That was, I think, how I got really close to John Lennon. And of course, I learned very quickly, as we all did, he was extremely bright. He really was a very, very intelligent young man. And he knew how to talk about politics. We would talk about the difference between his country and America. And the other Beatles didn't talk about that. Paul never wanted me to ever tell anything about my travels with anybody. We talked about other things. And before we leave, though, Ivor, I do want to tell how Paul McCartney saved my career, and he really did.
Go ahead, please.
You want to hear how he saved it?
We're dying to hear how that happened. Go ahead.
And by the way, for Bob, on my Beatles presentations, I only have my 7 cuts that I use, but I do promote the fact that you will learn 2 things tonight or today when I do my presentation. One is you will get the answer to the most often asked question I ever receive, and that question is, how did you get on the tour? And I tell the story that I've told you today about that.
Thank you.
Okay, then I say, and you will learn how Paul McCartney saved my career. Okay.
I am dying to hear this one.
Paul was, as Ivor knows, when we were in Dallas, the owner of the airline that chartered for that first tour, he had invited the Beatles to his ranch in Missouri for 3 days, and we were stuck in Dallas. We weren't invited to the ranch. At least I wasn't. I don't think Ivor was.
I was not. None of us were. This was supposed to be Brian's birthday, and this was supposed to be a Beatle break for the Beatles only. But go ahead, Art.
Okay. When we were there at the motel in Dallas, they brought, well, in those days, people must remember that most of the places in the South were still not open to liquor. You couldn't walk into a bar and buy a drink in very few places in the South. It just wasn't allowed. Now, then some places you could buy a cordial and pour it into your drink yourself. They weren't allowed to pour it, but you bought the cordial. Okay, what places started doing to overcome that was they had private clubs, and so motels would have a private club, and all it meant was that if you registered at the motel, you were a member of the private club, and that was the bar. Well, this motel had waitresses that were dressed similarly to Playboy bunnies, similar costumes. They weren't the same, but they were very short skirts and you know the rule. Okay, they had a photo op upstairs in the Beatles suite, and we were all there sitting around. And so when the girls were leaving, Paul said to me, "Get me her." And I said, "Get her yourself. I'm not your pimp." And Paul really was angry with me. And I know that he was really ticked. So that incident happened. Okay, now this is a story that goes back to when we were in Milwaukee. First, I have told you the bureau chief, who was my boss on the tour, he did not want me covering the Beatles tour. For whatever reason, he didn't. He believed that I was covering politics, and that didn't mix with the Beatles. Well, that was overcome by the president of the company. Okay, now I'm in Milwaukee, and the bureau chief had never talked to me all through the tour now, when we started, and now we were in Milwaukee. And my phone rang in my room, and it was the bureau chief. He said, "My daughter, Margaret Ann's got a ticket when you guys come to Baltimore." He said, "But I want autographs." I said, "Jim, I can't do that. We made a deal with the Beatles that we would not ask for autographs." He hung up on me. I knew I was in deep trouble, and this man could control my career. Okay, now the rest of the tour goes on. We're on our way back to New York. They're going to perform that night at the Paramount Theater, and the next day they were headed home. Paul came up to see John. I told you John and I sat together on the plane. Paul came up and John was not there. And he said, "Where's John?" And I said, "I don't know." And he started to walk away, and I said, "Paul," I said, "would you do me a favor?" He said, "What?" I said, "My boss's daughter saw you in Baltimore." I said, and he saw me grab my tape recorder from under my seat, and I said, "Would you say a few words to her about it?" He said, "Turn it on." And I turned the recorder on, and I said, "I'm with Paul McCartney. We're on our way back to New York. Tomorrow the Beatles head for home." I said, "Paul, Margaret Ann Schneider saw you in Baltimore, and she waved to you, and she thinks she saw you wave back. And I have this recording, which you will hear if you hear if I live long enough to do any more Beatles performances." And he said, of course, that was Margaret Ann Schneider, a little whip of a girl with brown hair and blah, blah, blah. And he goes on, and it's just a fabulous recording. And then he even says to me about meeting my wife and blah, blah. Well, it's just would tear your heart out to hear what he said to Margaret Ann Schneider. And when I got home, I had an engineer put that on a cassette, and I didn't say a word to Jim Snyder, my bureau chief. I just sent it to him. And he still hadn't talked to me now after the tour. And about a week later, he called me up and he said, I had a babysitter tonight. I took the babysitter home, and when I came back, I went by Margaret Ann's room, and I thought I heard something, and I pushed the door open, and she was laying there staring up at me with the tape recorder by her ear, and she said, "He said my name. He said my name." That saved Art Schreiber's career.
Fantastic story. So not only were you John Lennon's civics instructor, you were pals, you sort of made up with Paul. And I must tell you one quick thing. You triggered a thought, because the girls that were in that bunny club next to the hotel, I got to know the den mother, who was not really a mother. She was quite a young woman, and she was a lovely lady, and she told me all about life in the hutch. So we'll move on from there. Anyway, the other question,
that just shows you, Bob, how much better reporter he was than I
was. You both sound pretty good to me.
Yeah.
I must ask you this. You told us some fabulous stories about John and about Paul. And, I had some strong feelings about George and Ringo. But you tell me, what was the Arthur Schreiber view of those two?
Well, George and I really did become good friends, but you would never know it because he never talked, as you well know. I am not kidding. We would play. Now, understand, you know how long a Monopoly game takes. Well, it was not unusual for us to play 3 Monopoly games, and the sun would be coming up, and we'd still be playing. I'll bet George didn't say 50 words in the whole night.
Yeah.
John always kidded him about, he was always the banker, and John kidded him accused him of stealing money, which I am convinced he didn't. Stealing monopoly money, I'm talking about. And but John would just ignore George would just ignore John, accusing him of whatever. And of course, John always wanted certain things. Sometimes he wanted the race car. Sometimes he wanted the battleship. You know, those were the pieces for the Monopoly board. And he changed all the time. And George would just, George liked one piece or another, but he would do whatever. If John wanted one, okay, that was, even though George wanted that piece, John would get it. And John always wanted to land on Park Place or Boardwalk, of course, the most expensive real estate on the board. And the trouble was, if he did land, it took all his money, generally to buy, and then he was always out of money, and so he didn't win very many games. But he would then accuse George of stealing the money or not making change the way he should have. We just had a good time, but George never talked about it. And in fact, when they wrote on, as you have seen, Ivor, I have a shadow box with a photograph of all of us on the tour with the Beatles in that photograph, and each wrote above his photograph something to me. And Paul wrote he even wrote at the very end, he wrote sorry, which he was sorry that he got angry with me. So George wrote about the B&O Railroad. For whatever reason, George wanted to always win and own the B&O Railroad. Now, we know if you play Monopoly at all, you know that railroads aren't very prime real estate. You get a couple $100 every time somebody lands on it, but it's not a great deal. But he always and he never could explain to me why he wanted the B&O. I don't think it has any significance in England. I know it doesn't, did in America. But anyway, that was George. And George and I really hit it off, but George didn't talk.
Well, let me interrupt you 1 second, Arthur, and say, of course he didn't talk. And my job on the trip was to write his column, Ghost to column for him. So he never talked to me, and I made the column up until he got upset. Until he got upset about I was writing a load of drivel, but the answer was that you couldn't get a word out of him. But I want to hear from you, Arthur, because what about Ringo? Now, Ringo was the new boy on the block in a way, and also wasn't the most conversational guy. I mean, did you find that as well?
Yes. However, I did get him to talk, and I do have a cut of Ringo. I asked him about the difference between British disc jockeys and American disc jockeys. And to hear him, you got to hear the cut because I can't do it justice with his British accent, and he talks just the way British disc jockeys did in those days, and he talked just the way American disc jockeys talked in those days. And you know, American disc jockeys talked 180 words a minute, and British disc jockeys were very laid back talked like this. Well, he imitates the two disc jockeys and explained the difference, and it is very good. He liked to talk to me about the differences in disc jockeys and radio stations. He couldn't get over in America all the stations. In Britain, in those days, you had the BBC, and that was it. Then also, I talked to him about all the things that people threw at the Beatles. If people were listening and didn't know, jelly beans were very common, but as John Lennon said, don't throw jelly beans. They're in America, they're hard, they're like rocks. In Great Britain, they're soft. And then cake. Everybody threw cakes and pieces of clothing and jewelry and so forth. Well, Ringo sat up at the drums. He was above everybody else, and he always said that he was in line of all those what were tossed, and he had to duck them more than anybody else. And he may have. I don't know whether that was true or not, but he believed that.
Arthur, I remember you telling me, just a quick follow-up question to George. You told me why you thought George never ever smiled in public. What do you remember? Do you remember what you said? Why George was not a smiler?
No.
Okay, well, I think you said, I recall that George had crooked teeth. Do you remember that?
Oh, yes. That I just remembered, and he told me that. He did tell me that he didn't like the looks of his teeth.
And that jibes exactly, because young people growing up in England at the time I grew up, and the Beatles were my age, never went to the dentist. They never had anything like that, so they grew up with the teeth they grew up with. Anyway, that's just a kind of a rather quaint, odd little fact that you confirmed, I remember.
Yes. I didn't know that they didn't go to the dentist.
No, because, they just didn't. Here, in today's age, all the kids are full of braces or, expensive stuff. But George came from a working class family and he never got his teeth even cleaned. Yeah. The interesting thing about Arthur is that he's written a book, but it's not about the Beatles. Can you tell us about your book? And I know that both Warren and Bob would like to tell listeners how to get your book and where to get your book.
Okay, I wrote a book, but not about the Beatles. For those who don't know, I have always had very poor eyesight. I was very nearsighted all my life as a kid. I wore bottom glasses and was very, very nearsighted. So much so that I could have been declared legally blind as a kid. But in those days, nobody knew about that. And when I was in my 40s, early 40s, I got transferred to Los Angeles, and at a meeting of broadcasters, I suddenly started seeing what we now know is a floater. Nearsighted people have floaters, and they're pieces of the retina that float around, and you can watch them. And if you look at something bright and light, then you see dark floaters. Well, suddenly I'm seeing this floater get big and big and big, and what was happening was my retina was detaching, and I didn't know it. When I got home, this meeting was in San Francisco. I got home, told my wife, I can't see out of one eye. We got to the doctor next morning. He sends me to a specialist, and right away I had a detached retina, and they tried to reattach it, but never could. And I lost the sight of that eye. But my doctor that did all the surgeries was a well-known retinal surgeon known across the country. He told me, he said, we're not going to mess with that. Someday you may need that eye. And so 12 years later, I got transferred from Minneapolis. Now I had left Westinghouse because my wife died of a cancer. I was left with being a single parent. I was transferred to New York to manage WINS. My kids did not want to go to New York. I had dragged them around the country. I listened to them, and I resigned from the company. And so I ran a transportation company, and a couple of years later, a headhunter called me, and I was hired by Hubbard Broadcasting to run their flagship AM station in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And they owned KOB in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which had the same frequency as KABC in New York. Big 50,000 water, covered the whole Southwest. And Stan Hubbard sent me down there to man it because the station was doing very badly, and he sent me down to Albuquerque to try to rescue KOB, which we did, I'm proud to say. But a year later, after arriving in Albuquerque, I woke up on vacation in a resort outside of Santa Fe, and the lights were out. I was totally blind. Stan Hubbard and his wife Karen, the owners of Hubbard Broadcasting, they don't have stockholders, only the family. They never gave up on me. They did not quit on me. And I went through 14 eye surgeries, but they could not get any sight back. And so I managed KOB for 10 years as a blind man. But thanks to the National Federation of the Blind, I really learned a lot of blind skills, and I learned how to function as a blind person. I wanted to write a book to tell what happened to me and to help people who might be losing sight. And I have helped many, thank goodness, in this country. Today, I still am chairman of the Commission for the Blind, the state of New Mexico. Every governor since 1986 has reappointed me, and Republican or Democrat, because blind people don't know party. They need help. And I'm still chairman of the Commission for the Blind in the state of New Mexico. I wrote a book with a friend of mine who is a lawyer. He has written several books, and I it's really as I told him. And the book is called Out of Sight, Blind but Doing All Right. And I only mention what I've done, with the Beatles and with Jack Kennedy and Martin Luther King. I just mentioned that I covered them, but I don't really talk about anything like that. It's really aimed at helping people who are going blind or losing sight.
Well, that was a fascinating and moving listen. I don't know how to thank you enough. It was riveting from start to finish.
Yeah, I must say his storytelling is fantastic. And although we've lost him because of maybe his battery ran out on his phone, because his battery certainly doesn't run out as Arthur Schreiber, does it?
Certainly not. That was fantastic from start to finish.
Well, thank you, Bob, very much. And I
he's
look
back.
forward
Right.
Oh, you're back.
I can meet you. By the way, a man by the name of Paul Ingalls, who is a producer for NPR, lives here in Albuquerque. He knows who you are and right away knew your podcast when I told him that I was going to be on today. And so Paul and others who are into that business know about Bob Wilson, that's for sure.
Well, and Warren Brown, too, with his art, because of him, I think they know who I am, but I'm touched that would be the case. So he advised you, but you came on anyway.
Ah, very good.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate it.
I just want to once again thank my friend Ivor Davis, because he's still the best reporter I've ever known, and I've always envied his ability as a reporter, and his new book is really great. I was in L.A. Covering, I was managing the all-news station when the Manson murders occurred.
Wow.
Well, thank you very much for that little plug. I appreciate it. And it's, your book, I mean, talk about doing more than all right, Arthur, doing more than all right.
Okay, and one other thing. We have Ivor's wife, Sally, was a tremendous reporter herself, and I am proud to say that we hired her at KFWB in L.A., and she, within very quickly, won all kinds of awards for us with her tremendous ability as a reporter. And it was wonderful, and she wrote a fabulous obit for my wife, Alice, which was broadcast on KFWB.
All right. I thank you, Arthur. Arthur, can you please tell us where we can find your book again on the web? Because you faded out there when you were telling us.
Okay, it's on Amazon, and it's also at, what's the big bookstore that's still in business?
Barnes & Noble?
Yes, Barnes & Noble has it. At least they did. I don't know whether they could get it for you. And if worse comes to worse, send me something and I'll get you a book.
Well, that would always remind me of this show whenever I see the book, and I would think of you and the best show we ever did. I think I was smart to be like George Harrison and shut my mouth and listen to you two guys.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure, and I appreciate it. And maybe one of these days, Ivor and I'll be doing a Beatles show, and maybe I'll get to meet you.
Well, that would make my day for sure.
Yes, it would.
Okay. And thanks very much to the gentleman that finally got us hooked up.
And that would be me, Arthur. Warren.
Okay.
Thank you, Warren.
You're welcome. And Ivor, can you tell us about your books and where listeners can find them also?
Well, yeah, the same thing. I mean, it's been such a pleasure being on the show with my pal Arthur that, it's made my week. Yeah, and you can get my book at ivordavisbooks.com, and it would be great. But get hold of Arthur's books because his book is a powerful, inspirational story that you must read.
That sounds great, and I thank you for that.
I concur.
And thank you, Arthur, for being on the show. You have some great stories, and I'm glad Ivor got you to come on, and he did a great job in the interview. I enjoyed every minute of it.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, guys.
Okay.
Come out to Albuquerque sometime.
All right.
I'm on my way. As soon as they let us travel again, I'm out there.
Okay.
All right,
Bye-bye.
Arthur. You be safe, my friend.
Okay. Bye-bye.
And
Thank you.
Thank you again. All right, Ivor. You're still on, Ivor. So
Okay. Well, I mean, I think Arthur was pretty fantastic with his stories. I mean, Arthur is in his 90s, and
Wow.
he's sharp. He's just. Oh, I can see you guys. He's so sharp that I mean, his stories are great, and when he told the stories, very often it triggered memories for me as well. I haven't talked to him about the Beatles for a long time.
Right. Yeah, that interesting stuff, stories I never heard before.
Yeah, I mean the story about Paul and his. I mean, he gave John Lennon his education. I mean, John Lennon was always sort of publicly minded and all the rest of it, but he loved to talk to Arthur because Arthur had was a little bit older, a little bit more mature than the rest of us, and like 10 years more mature. But he was his professor, if you like, in America in 1964.
Right. I would have liked to talk to him a little bit more about MLK and his JFK stuff and all that. That would be interesting.
One of the things he mentioned, and you might keep this in mind for both of you, Bob and Warren, he said he has some tape recordings of his interviews.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you, for a further show, another show, maybe could get him to give you some of the recordings or loan you some of the recordings, because it would make, I mean, I'd love to hear them myself. But anyway, just...
That would be amazing. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, if Ivor, if he could send you or Bob any snippets from them, I can put them on the show.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. I don't know. I don't know where he has them. We didn't talk about that.
Right.
But I'd forgotten that he did tell me that they were stolen, and then somebody was selling them, in an underground way, and he was able to retrieve some of his stuff. So that's pretty unique. I mean, I'd love to hear.
Right.
Frankly,
I was thinking how much we'd love to hear him when he was telling the story. How nice it would be to hear that.
Yep.
Yeah, just great. And so I'm glad you, in a way, we kind of, it was a clever idea of yours to get me involved again, because I thought you would do, but we were, we're old pals.
Right.
And
I think you did great.
I was fascinated.
Yes, it was very much so. And, I was going to ask him if he ever discovered any of his tapes anywhere on the internet, and maybe figured out who stole them that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the story was, if you recall, that somebody came to him after he was speaking somewhere and said, the person then said that he got them on the internet. Well, who knows?
Right. Yeah, it's kind of hard to trace it back either way you look at it. So
I just
At
want
least you
to
got them again.
you, Warren, for making it happen. I mean, we had a few sweaty moments.
yeah, yeah, it took
You
me a
were able
while.
to solve that, so take a bow.
I'll do that. Thank you very much, Ivor. I appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. You are a favorite of mine, and I enjoy every minute.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. And
That was the best show we'll ever do. You were fantastic, and thank you so much.
well, it was just talking to an old buddy, so it makes it easy.
I
And
think
I,
you always make it look easy. But we didn't. I don't think we mentioned your books on the show.
Oh, doesn't we did at the end, but I mean it was really about Arthur, and I think Arthur had some wonderful stories, and his recall is great. And as I say, he's you wouldn't know he was slightly older than me, would you?
He's
right.
sharper in his 90s than I was in my 20s.
Exactly.
Good show.
Thanks for doing that. Thanks for making it happen, you guys. Always a pleasure. And
Yes, it is.
and have a great Sunday.
And you also, my friend, and you stay in and stay safe, Ivor, and I look forward to the next one.
Thank you. Cheers.
You
All right.
Thank
have,
you.